Hello there, I'm Laura Kyle. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the world produces enough food to feed every single one of its 8 billion people. We ask why then hundreds of millions go hungry every day. Also this week, the communities in Africa on the brink of starvation, facing their worst food crises in more than 40 years. And with the scale of this food insecurity, why is funding for aid programs that tackle hunger on the decline? There's no shortage of food being produced globally, yet more than 735 million people faced chronic hunger in 2022. The UN has called for urgent humanitarian action to save lives and livelihoods. It's warned the target of ending hunger by 2030 might not be reached. So, if the world has enough to feed its people, why do so many nations suffer from food insecurity and hunger? Leaders from around the world tackled that question at a recent summit on global food security in London. Somalia's president laid out some of the causes and some potential solutions.
The persistence of food insecurity is due to a variety of factors, including climate shocks, heavy reliance on increasingly expensive food imports, global disruption of supply chain, and weak infrastructure. We therefore need a multifaceted approach that intertwines investment in peace and security, climate-adaptive technology and infrastructure, financial inclusion, as well as robust economic and trade policies.
The developing world is where the biggest challenges exist. According to the Global Hunger Index, around 40 countries are in a serious or alarming state of hunger. Nearly all are in Africa and South Asia. The report says there's been little progress made in reducing global hunger since 2015. So let's have a look at the worst affected places. As you can see, with the exception of Yemen, all of them are located in sub-Saharan Africa. Each of these countries has been affected in some way by conflict and/or climate change. If we zoom in a bit, we can see in Democratic Republic of Congo, around a third of its population are suffering undernourishment. That means they are consistently unable to meet their minimum dietary needs. And here, in Central African Republic, perhaps the worst affected of all countries, nearly half the population isn't getting enough food on a daily basis. But it isn't just a problem affecting the poorest countries. 17 million people in the United States were not getting enough to eat in 2022. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of people lining up at charity food banks. Many came to rely on government assistance. When those benefits ended, it caused a major spike in people going hungry. The roots of global hunger are connected with the idea of food insecurity. But what does this actually mean? Well, when we talk about food insecurity, we mean a situation where people don't have regular access to enough safe and nutritious food to lead a healthy life. War is the biggest disruptor of access to food. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has left 1 in 3 Ukrainians facing hunger, and it's had an even wider impact. Before the war, Ukraine produced enough food to feed 400 million people every year. A lot of that was exported to the Horn of Africa, a region particularly vulnerable to food shortages. Russia and Ukraine reached a deal to keep grain flowing, but that collapsed in July 2023. The fallout had even wider economic impacts. Disruption to global supply chains and uncertainty over the war led to sky-high inflation in many parts of the world, especially on the cost of food. All of this forced many people to cut back on basic nutrition. Climate change is another serious challenge. It's increased the frequency of extreme weather events like droughts and floods, which cause major disruptions to food supplies. The UN says 80% of the world's hungriest people live in regions that are highly vulnerable to these kinds of natural disasters. Let's talk about all this now with our panel of guests in Rome. David Laborde, Director of Agri-Food Economics Division at FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organisation. In Pretoria, South Africa, is Wandile Selobo, Chief Economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. And in Sydney is Karen Smaller, Co-founder and Executive Director of Shamba Centre for Food and Climate. A very warm welcome to all of you. David, let's start with you. Just outline for us how big a problem is global food insecurity.
So global food insecurity can mean different things at different levels of intensity. So let me start by the people that are really what we call in acute food insecurity. So their life and their livelihood can be threatened. That's 240 million people. So if we don't act, these people can move really relatively quickly to a famine situation or are already in a famine situation. Then you have the people that are chronically in hunger. So meaning that on a daily basis, they don't have enough to eat. And that's 750 million people. Then you have the people that are in what we call moderate or severe food insecurity. So people that have to change their way to eat in order to cope with high prices or sometimes to jump a lunch or a dinner. And that's 2.4 billion people. And then you have 3.1 billion people that cannot afford what we call a healthy diet. So they have enough to eat, but it's a lot of calories and not enough micronutrients. So you see, the problem is big and has different intensity depending where you are.
OK, yeah, the problem is huge. Wandile, why are most of the worst affected places, in fact, all of them apart from Yemen, in sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, Laura, I think the problem is perhaps maybe in two ways. And I mean, David sketched up where the numbers are looking like. But I think the first part of Africa is the fact that you have an income poverty problem, where many of the African economies have really not seen any solid growth that leads to improvements in living standards and people being employed in jobs where they can earn a decent wage and be able to procure what they need. That's the income poverty dynamic that we stuck with. The second part is also that the African continent still has very low agricultural productivity and imports quite a lot. Because if you look at the continent totality, I mean, we're still spending roughly $80 billion or so on food imports, and the sub-Saharan Africa just over $40 billion a year on food imports. So that does mean then that the lower income household in those countries continue to sit on the edge. And the reason for that will be the fact that the agricultural sector in the continent has really also not seen the levels of improvement in productivity where people, one, can have supplies for themselves, sufficient supplies for themselves, and secondly, be able to get into the commercial agricultural angle and generate some bit of income. So the poverty problem is quite complex, but the African continent has a lot more work to do going forward. But those two aspects that I've highlighted, I think they give a sense of color of how bad the problem is here.
Yeah, absolutely. Karen, the real tragedy here, isn't it, is that the world totally produces enough food. It's just that it's not distributed equally. Why is that?
So I think you're absolutely right. There is enough food produced in the world for everybody to eat. So what's going on? Why do we have these stubbornly high numbers? And as David said, 240 million people who could go into a famine situation quickly. So there's three main reasons there. I think the first is food is not always produced in the place where it's needed most. So you have certain people who can't access enough food because they live in areas that are too remote. There's not enough production in those areas. There's not enough infrastructure for food to get to those areas. There are not enough markets. So we have a big access issue in some places, some remote places. The second big issue is income. Just because there's enough food available, it doesn't mean you can afford it. And if you don't have enough income to buy the food you need, you're going to be food insecure. And that's a problem we see with a lot of people. And then the third big issue is the amount of food that we waste, either because we've got poor harvest infrastructure, so we waste the food that's harvested because it's not properly stored, or we waste it at the consumption edge because the consumption end, because we buy more food than we need and it rots and we waste it. So there's about a quarter to a third of the food that we produce globally that's wasted.
David, just highlight for us some of the knock-on impacts of a country, a nation, a family, a community, at all these different levels of being food insecure. What impact does it have on the most vulnerable? I'm thinking particularly of young people.
So this question of food insecurity is not evenly distributed in the population, as we have already touched. I will also say that actually the rural area face more food insecurity than the cities. Women are more food insecure than men in average, and during the COVID-19 crisis that have even increased. And when you translate it into livelihood and what it means for young people, but here I talk about kids also, it will have an impact for all their lives. So the current food insecurity situation and the shock that we are dealing with actually will have a long-lasting impact on their life because their body and mind is not going to develop as it should. And that's really what is concerned us. You know, it's even in terms of economic growth, there is a long-term price of this current situation.
Hey, Karen, we're no stranger to long-term impacts to this problem. It's been around for decades and decades. What I want to know is why progress on it has stalled. We've got the Global Hunger Index of 2023 showing that it's stalled. Progress on reducing hunger has largely stalled since 2015. What changed?
So indeed, we've been going in the right direction for the 30 years preceding 2015. And it's been in these last 6 or 7 years that we see this regression, that we see after 30 years of progress, suddenly going in reverse. And why is that happening? Well, the three main drivers of hunger are conflict, climate change, and economic shocks. And those shocks are now becoming more normal, and they are exacerbating food security. But it doesn't have to be that way. This is a problem that can be solved. We know how to solve it, and we know how much it will take to solve it. So actually, David and I were part of a research project, a 3-year research project called Series 2030, Sustainable Solutions to End Hunger, with about 80 odd other researchers around the world. And what we found is that if we can extra $330 billion worth of public investment in the countries where hunger is still prevalent, if we do that well, we can eradicate hunger. And we can do it by 2030, which is the deadline for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So it is possible. It's about more money, but it's not only about more money. It's also about how we use that money better. And the way the money is currently being spent is not as effective as it could be. So in that same report, we focus on 10 investment areas that we say are the highest impact, and that if that extra $330 billion is put into those 10 areas, by 2030, we can eradicate hunger.
Wandile, the African Development Bank says food insecurity on the continent of Africa should not be an issue in 5 years, that there is the technology and the financing there, as Karen is just highlighting. Do you share that optimism?
All right, there are certain fundamental things for me. I don't know what David and colleagues have experienced in their work, but my thinking, having observed what has worked in some of the countries in the region, is that we need a couple of things right that are in the government hands rather than mainly on the private sector in the capital. One, we need to improve Africa's agricultural productivity. If you look at how much expansion has happened, say, in grain production from the early 2000s to now, that has been through the expansion in area planting rather than the improvement in yields. Then that will mean that we need to use better seed varieties, better genetics on animals, because that not only improves the availability in the continent, but the farmers that are creating those and the agribusinesses that will come along when the volumes are there, they will create some sort of jobs. But the governments, they need to do something around the land governance to attract the financing that will come into the sector. And secondly, be more open to adoption of certain technologies that they have blocked.
David, the way we farm, how much of that enters this discussion for you? If we get beyond the economics, beyond the existential crisis like conflict and climate change, looking at how we use the land, is this a discussion that runs concurrently? And are you leaning more towards labour-intensive, perhaps more sustainable in terms of ecology, uses of the land, more locally produced food, or do you veer more towards the technological side and the GM side of the argument?
So I think here there is a balance to be found, and it really also depends where you are. You cannot be dogmatic on that. We are dealing with different climate, different type of soil, different type of crops, and different type of producers. We have smallholders that have, unfortunately, even less than 1 hectare of land. But you cannot ask all their family to work intensively on 1 hectare of land with a very labor-intensive solution, because it means that all these people will be poor. So, finding way to increase productivity of land and labor is key to push for development. But you want also to make sure that, basic human rights are respected. Unfortunately, today, on one hand, you have a lot of workers on farmland that are in extreme poverty, so they don't even, earn not $2 a day. Unfortunately, in many, even cocoa farm today in Africa, you have people that live with less than $1 a day. So here, that's how we redistribute the value chain profits, if you want. But I would say at the same time, these new technology are needed. In some cases, better seed, but better seed doesn't mean only GM. That can be one part of the solution, but it really depends which problem you want to fix where. We have also to think about low-scale mechanization with drones, using more digital technology with early warning system to allow farmers, including small farmers, to have access to better weather forecast, better information on prices, both output and input. We can bring all this package in Africa, including to smallholders, because we have already a number of other farms that are using them. But this inequality of income we were talking about when we think about who can buy food and eat food, we also have to deal with it in the inequality of access to technology and solution. And it's only if we make it inclusive also on the supply side that we will deliver on food security, on better sustainability, and overall in a world that will be fairer. And as Karina said, to make sure we realign where we produce food and where we need food, especially when the infrastructure are not there and we can increase income and livelihood for these people.
Karen, you said earlier, you're quite right to be optimistic on solving world hunger if we had the money available. $330 billion, I believe you said. The trouble is, the World Food Programme this year, in September 23, said that there was a funding gap of 60%, the biggest shortfall in its 60-year history. So why are we seeing a decline in funding at a time when we seem to be needing it most?
Okay, so we've got to be careful here about the numbers, because if you actually look at the amount of aid that's gone to the World Food Programme in the last few years, it's actually increased. We looked at the numbers and the flow. The amount of aid going to WFP has increased, but the need has increased even more. So because there's even greater need, they're not filling their financing gap. But it's not because there's not more money available. There is, especially for the humanitarian assistance, there is more money available. It's roughly doubled in the last 5 years. Unfortunately, we can't say the same for the money going into the more long-term investments to deal with the structural problems of hunger. That amount of assistance has been stagnating or slightly shrinking.
Right.
But the problem is, because of this increased shocks, the climate shocks, the economic shocks, the conflict shocks, and particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, we see much greater need.
Okay.
And I really think that part of this solution, and then I'll let you continue, but I think part of this solution is making sure that we better use that humanitarian assistance to contribute to this longer development goal. Because otherwise this bucket that WFP needs is going to keep growing.
Because one of the problems that the WFP highlights, or the warnings that it highlights, is that we're entering a humanitarian doom loop, taking from the hungry to save the starving. How do you stop that from happening?
I think, Laura, the only way to stop this thing being perpetual is, again, going back to say, how do you revitalize Africa's agriculture, not only on a smallholder side, but also on putting them on a route towards commercialization. And the African governments have to do their own part on a policy framework on doing that and attracting the private sector investments on that progression that could happen. Then the rest of the other assistance that Karine and David were referring to is something that assists in the near to medium term. Because then if that structural change in Africa's agriculture is not happening, then we are sitting in a perpetual cycle here, where whenever there are these climate shocks, that will be more frequent, as well as these conflicts that we see they are being more frequent also in the continent, then we are stuck in this cycle. The only way we have to get out of this is to say, how can agriculture play a much more fundamental role and get into a space where it is sustainable, it is at a commercial, it can support work, not only just family farms, but really creating jobs at a decent wage and be able to feed on the food and fiber value chain in a sustainable. In that way, we could be able then to see that promise of Africa being able to feed to an extent the world and actually have a sustainable agricultural sector and improvement, and a livelihood for rural Africans will be there. But again, to Karina's point, there are remote areas which cannot be reached, and you do need public infrastructure, roads, water supplies to be in those areas for any serious investments to actually get in. And the only people that can do that are the governments that have to do their work on that part. Until those things is done, then we are in this cycle where we're coming on after every natural disaster, year in, year out, assisting people. Because the intervention we're making now are no different than the interventions that we were making 10 years ago. It's just that the scale and the frequency is changing. But we have to think deeply then to say, how do we assist people in transitioning more fundamentally? And I think it's important we look into that.
Okay. Karen, I just want to go back to one of the causes of hunger, conflict. Food being weaponized. We're seeing it in Gaza, we've seen it in Ukraine, we've seen it in Yemen. How do we prevent that happening?
So I would say, first, it's very clear under international humanitarian law that you're not allowed to use starvation as a weapon of war. So it's not allowed. It's a violation of international humanitarian law, and that needs to stop where it is happening. The other thing is, and again, under international humanitarian law, you have to allow the humanitarian agencies to access the civilian population and provide them humanitarian assistance. And here again, it's not a technical problem. We have humanitarian agencies who've had decades of experience, who know how to access people during conflicts, when there's an extreme weather event. So the only reason they wouldn't be allowed to access the people is because the conflicting parties are not allowing them to access. So I think there it's really important that this right to access humanitarian assistance is upheld even in the context of conflict.
Okay. David, many viewers watching this programme will be asking on an individual level, what can I do? What can we all do ourselves? What would be your answer for that?
So the first thing is really to maintain this awareness and to put pressure on your government to do better allocation of resources depending when you are. As it was said, many African countries really need to walk the talk about prioritizing agriculture and agricultural development in terms of their own investment. There is a continental framework called CADEP where government have taken the commitment to spend 10% of their public expenditure in terms of agricultural development. Very few countries, not to say just one or two on the continent, have reached it. And in high-income countries and middle-income countries is how much your government is going to help addressing these global inequalities through better aid, with more aid, with also thinking about what should be the technological transfer we need to do. Because government, we are not going to replace them, and we need them to do a number of actions that my colleagues are discussed. But then after, you may also make more responsible choice in terms of consumption, avoiding to waste food, and making sure that when you buy some product, all the people in the value chain, in particular, if you go for a cocoa bar, to make sure that the people on the other side of the planet producing this cocoa have a living income to be able to have a decent life. And so we all contribute, but at different level. And what you do as an individual matters, but what we do as a community, as country and government will still lead the action.
Okay. There we will have to leave our discussion today. Many thanks to our guests, David Laborde, Wandile Silobo and Karen Smaller. And that is our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via X. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do so. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more online for you at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Laura Kyle from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.